Hello, my fellow readers. Today I'm going to be talking about a middle grade book called Planet Earth is Blue. So this book was actually part of my Read Harder challenge from Book Riot, and it was for the category of read a children's book that centers on a disabled character but not their disability. And this book was the perfect choice. I knew right away when I read the synopsis for it that this was the perfect book for me to read, that I would get swept up in it. Planet Earth is Blue is set in 1986 during the time when the Challenger is about to launch. And it centers around 12-year-old Nova. And Nova has autism, and she is not able to speak clearly. And she has a lot of communication problems, partly because of the way that she was raised and just partly because of her condition. And of course it's the 80s, so they didn't know like that much at that point. I mean, they were progressing, but at that point they still weren't able to deal with autism the way that we are now. Like there was still a lot, there was a lot that they didn't understand, and they would generalize the condition and not work as well with the individual. But it was starting to progress a little, but it still wasn't that great. And so a lot of that might have to do with why she wasn't as good at being able to communicate, because even if not verbally, could she have had the education to do more in some other format? We don't entirely know, because it's not the focus of it, because again, this is a book with a character with a disability, but the story doesn't focus on that disability. It's a part of who she is, but it's not the narrative that she's telling. So Nova is a huge fan of space and the space program, and a lot of that comes from her older sister. So her older sister, Bridget, has always been kind of this role model for Nova, and Nova feels is like the one person that could always understand her, that it didn't matter that she had problems verbalizing and like written communication. It didn't matter that Bridget got her. So during this narrative, Nova's actually writing letters to Bridget, trying to figure out where Bridget is and when will she be coming back, because Bridget promised that no matter what happened, she would be back with Nova when the Challenger launch occurs. And so Nova is addressing these letters to Bridget, trying to let Bridget know where she is and how to reach her, so that they can view the space shuttle launch together. And through the narrative and the letters, we discover that the two sisters were taken away from their mother when Nova was still pretty young. I mean, she's only 12 in this, so she was even younger at the time. I don't remember how old. I think they were at least with their mother until Nova was 5, I think, and maybe it was after that. So I'm going to say it was probably around the 5-year-old mark that she was taken away from her mother, she and Bridget. And after that, Bridget and Nova were sent from foster home to foster home. And, Bridget used to say that there was no such thing as a forever home, that believing that people would be willing to take you in is just not likely. So they had a couple of times where, even Bridget was starting to think that this could be a couple that keeps us, and then the people would decide they couldn't handle it. Either they had their own kids, or they just didn't want the trouble anymore. And so you'd see through the narrative just this development of the two sisters and their relationship and everything that they've had to put up with over these past 7 years as kids living in the foster system. And again, this is probably also part of why Nova hasn't been able to develop in more ways to find some other level of communication, because they just haven't had that stability. And it's very affecting and emotional, just thinking about these children in these situations and knowing that there are cases like this every day. And even though this is set in 1986, it's really no different today than it was back then. And so as the story progresses, We know that Nova is currently with a foster family that seem very devoted to her. They're taking excellent care of her. They're making sure to allow her the space to try to communicate, and trying to pick proper schooling for her and get her the best that they can. So we do see that her current home is more stable, but we don't know where Bridget is and what happened to her, and how the two got separated. We only know that Nova is trying to communicate with Bridget and find out when she'll be back to view the space shuttle launch with her. And so in the book, as Bridget attends school, we get to meet other kids with disabilities that, at first even Bridget doesn't know what to think because everybody's different, and a lot of it is too much for Bridget to handle. There's just too much noise, that sometimes she gets overstimulated. But they were charming. It's like seeing that friendship group develop from them as well, and getting to understand the way that each works and communicates. And that was sweet and lovely. I don't know, just all these like good things, but in the background, you're also always filled with like this almost foreboding feeling. One, because you know that historically, the event that Nova is most looking forward to is going to end very tragically. And I think there's a lot to be said about prior to the Challenger, and spoiler alert if you don't know history, but the Challenger that we're talking about in 1986, the Challenger exploded. Well, it wasn't necessarily an explosion, but we'll just say it exploded after launch, shortly after launch, back in 1986, and all of the staff died. And for the U.S., it was difficult because it was the first time we were sending a civilian into space, and she was a teacher, and so pretty much schools around the whole U.S. were tuning into this because it was teacher, and kids were really excited. And prior to that time, there'd been a few issues with space flight. It wasn't a perfect system, but there hadn't been that level of a tragedy. So things still seemed optimistic, and that there would be a bright future for space travel. And I think that there was, after the tragedy occurred and everybody died, and I think especially, as kids were watching that occur, and it kind of much like with the 9/11 event is when you see like that kind of thing as a child, there is almost that kind of growing up almost. It's like that whole coming of age. Sometimes in kids who shouldn't necessarily understand that kind of tragedy yet. And, we've seen it especially with media, that when an event like the Challenger or 9/11 occurs, there is a growing up that kids do, because you have to sort of, in order to cope with that kind of, that level. And I think that's what occurred even after the Challenger. There was almost a dampening of the optimism and the push that we used to have with the space program. And, we are still part of, sending up people into space and everything, but it's not the level of excitement, and it's not the level that existed prior to that time. And I think that's fascinating, that it was, I believe, almost a coming of age moment for the space program in general. But in terms of this story, you get that foreboding throughout it, because what Nova's going to have to face when the event occurs. And there is sort of this feeling that whatever happened with her sister is going to culminate then too. Like you're going to have that revelation about what happened. And the story is just excellent at having that kind of engagement. And I loved Nova, one, and just the humanizing aspect of that, having a character who is diverse. She's, you know, you realize all the thoughts that are in her head, and she can't properly share them. And there's a lot of times where people overlook her, like she can't answer the questions that she wants to answer. Like she answers them in her mind, but she can't verbalize them. So people will tell her that she needs to be quiet or whatever, but she's really trying to communicate. And it's a humanizing moment, and a moment to realize actions that you could potentially take that could harm somebody who is, there's more to them than what you might first perceive. And I really enjoyed that about this book. I think that it was great at just that element of showing people are people, and you know, you should do your best to communicate with people as a person. I don't know, I liked it. I love the overall story. It was definitely engaging, trying to figure out what happened with Bridget, because she was such a devoted sister. So it definitely made you want to know what happened with Bridget, but also her foster family, Nova's foster family, was just good people in general too. So you kind of wanted to see things work out with Nova and this family, because they were good people that cared about Nova and were treating her as a person, and that was a beautiful part of it. It's just great for bringing up like all these emotions and thoughts, and it's a middle grade, so the target audience for this is your tweens, you know. But I think it's definitely a story that's can be enjoyed by a multitude of ages, definitely through adulthood. I enjoyed this story very much. It was a quick read, but it had so much emotional depth that I don't know, this would be a great one to read and have really good discussions with the younger readers. But also being able to look at historical facts and data that's presented here, but also discussions about disabilities and about autism and how to treat people. There's so much to this book, and that you could do with this book, that I thought it was brilliant. Be a great book club pick for sure. I was just at that level that it was so good. I loved the historical aspect. So much of it was so good. Yeah. There's not too much more I want to say about this book, other than I would highly recommend this book for people to read. It was very, very good. I'm so glad that I chose it. I'm so glad that I saw it on a list. It was so good. Yeah. That's it for this video. Until next time, bye.